Whenever you import or export data from one system to another, there's always the possibility of a number of different error conditions that might occur due to the data. The Data Import-Export framework provides various means to view and manage these errors. In this lesson, I will show you how to handle these errors that occur while importing data. Let's import a vendor file that has some errors in the file and see what happens. The vendor file has one valid record, the first record. The next row in this file is invalid when you're trying to move the data from the staging table to the target. And the last row in this file is invalid because it's missing some constraints and it cannot even be imported into the staging table. So let's see what happens when you try to import this file using the Data Import-Export framework. Before we start the import process, let's switch to the Data Import-Export framework parameters. And you can see that there are a couple of error handling parameters that you can set. The first one is the ignore error. We're going to select this because if there are errors in certain records, we want to still continue with processing the rest of the file. The second parameter is to create an error file. What this does is all of the records that have errors are going to be put in a separate file. Let's close this. And now let's create a processing group. We're going to create a new processing group to process the errors file. I'm going to call this processing group vendors_errors. Save this record and click on the Entities button. Since this is the vendor file, I'm going to choose the vendor entity. The source data format is still a CSV. And for the sample file, we're going to use the sample file that I showed you before. And that's the vendors_errors file. Next, we're going to click on Generate Source Mapping. And we get an info log that says the vendor entity mapping is done successfully. We can click on Modify Source Mapping to just see how the file is mapped to staging. All of the fields in the source are mapped to fields in the staging. Again, this happened because the names of the fields in the source were the same as what was in staging. Let's click on Validate to validate whether the mapping has been set up correctly. And it tells us that the entity is validated and ready for data import-export. Now click on the preview source file. And here you immediately start seeing that the info log message says there's one record which has an error. And you can look at the errors in the error log. I'll show you the error handling a little bit later. But first, you can see the preview only has the 2 rows. The third row, which had an error, is not in the preview. Let's try to import this file from the source into the staging table. So I'm going to close the processing group setup. On the vendor and errors processing group, click on the double arrow and select Get Staging Data. Select the job ID for vendor errors and you can press OK. Then run this execution, and we're going to run the load in a synchronous way. So we're not going to use batch processing. Press OK. Now you get info log message which says 2 vendor records were inserted into staging and 1 records didn't get inserted into staging, and that you can look at the errors in the log. Let's look at the errors that have occurred in staging so far. To do that, on the processing group, select the vendor errors processing group and select execution history. Now, here you can click on error log, and you will see that for the job that ran, there are 2 records that got inserted in staging and 1 that didn't get inserted in staging. You can click on the staging log details, and it tells you the problem with that particular file. It says the data value violates integrity constraints. You can also click on the view error file, and this shows you all of the records from the source file which did not get loaded into staging because they had errors. In this case, this particular record did not get loaded because it was missing a field that was necessary or mandatory in the staging table. Next, let's try to insert the 2 records that did get inserted into the staging into the target. To do this, we're going to go back to the processing group for vendor errors and click on copy data to target. Now we're going to select the vendor errors and press OK, and then click on run. We're going to run this in a synchronous mode, so I'm going to keep the batch processing deselected and press OK. Now you can see that the info log says there was 1 record that was created and 0 records updated, and that there might be errors. So let's go back to the execution history and see what happened between the staging to target copy. Now you can select the error log again, and in the stage you see that there's a stage for target for the vendors underscore error job. Select the info log, and you see an info log that tells you that the record for which has an ID dem 1003 did not get inserted because the country region was missing. As you can see, the data import-export framework provides a number of options to handle errors that might occur due to bad data. The errors might occur also because validation rules failed or other reasons. This makes it very easy for administrators to manage the import and export operations, especially when there's a lot of data that's moving from outside AX into AX. In the next lesson, we'll talk about copying data between legal entities.